Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan, and today we're going to take a look at an old game I played back in 2013 against a computer opponent called Deep Sjeng 3.0. And Deep Sjeng was the computer world champion back in 2008 in speed chess. Deep Sjeng 1, 2 and 3 are no longer available, but you can still download an old version for free, so perhaps the site is worth checking out. So let's have a look at the game. I will be playing black. Game starts out with e4. I play knight to f6, the Alekhine. e5, knight to d5, and now of course there are several possibilities to continue play. White may choose c4 for instance. He may choose knight to f3. Even d4, but the move that was played was knight to c3, and this is called the Saemisch attack. I continue with knight takes knight, giving white the option to recapture either with the d or b pawns. So white chooses pawn takes knight on c3 with the d pawn, so not capturing towards the center. And we notice now that black has nothing developed at all. And white has two pawns developed. He's ready to activate bishop and queen. And the trade-off is that white has doubled pawns on the c-file. I continue with g6, the point of which is to fianchetto the bishop, attack the e5 pawn, and later on perhaps attack one of the doubled pawns on c3. But of course the pawn can easily be defended either with f4, queen to e2, bishop to f4, or knight to f3. So the pawn isn't in any real danger for the moment. White chooses a defense and plays bishop to f4. Excellent defense by white. I continue bishop to g7. White plays knight to f3. And at this moment I am playing black in the game Banik versus Korchnoi. So this is a known position. Korchnoi lost the game. He continued at this point with the d6 move, which is excellent. However, I'm going to play knight to c6 first, putting another attacker on the pawn on e5. White continues with bishop to b5. I simply castle. So I'm willing to play with double pawns on the c-file myself. White plays queen to e2, a very flexible move. White now has the option to castle either kingside or queenside, and adds another defender to the pawn on e5. And now I'm going to pressure the bishop on b5 to make up his mind. I play a6. And white can either recapture or capture the knight on c6 or choose to retreat. White takes on the knight, and now it's my turn to choose whether I want to recapture with the d pawn or the b pawn. I go for b takes c6, and this of course prevents the development of the rook with tempo, which would attack the queen. It allows me to fianchetto the bishop on b7, and it also allows me to develop the rook on the sweet spot on b8, after which the pawn on b2 will become a target. White chooses to castle queenside. Very aggressive, risky move, but not bad at all. So he's using his king to defend the pawn on b2. And the rook immediately goes to the half open file. And we can see now that I have three pieces developed. the bishop on g7, the rook on a8, which may come up to b7, but also this pawn on a6. So I'm going for the pawn storm. I immediately play a5. White develops the queen with queen to e4. This pins the pawn on c6 with the discovered attack on the rook, but rook to b8 and perhaps bishop to b7 may come up. But I continue with the pawn push and I play a4. White plays queen to e3, moving the queen twice. The game is still a draw, and this is a typical engine move. And now one of White's ideas is to perhaps play bishop to h6 and trade off the bishops that are targeting the pawn on e5 and one of the double pawns on c3. There are no immediate threats, so I play a3, attacking the pawn on b2. And this of course has to be responded to in some way. If pawn takes pawn, I can play rook takes pawn. White will have doubled isolated pawns, and he will have two pawns under attack. So recapturing is a poor decision. White may play b3, and we can see now that the c3 pawn no longer has a pawn defending it. Or alternatively, and this move was played, the aggressive b4 move. This of course makes the a2 pawn a target. Play continues with the thematic move d6. If White recaptures now, I can undouble my pawns, so that's perhaps not best. This threatens to take out the pawn on e5, activating my bishop, and it also allows the development bishop to e6, which is very interesting because it immediately attacks the undefended pawn on a2. White first plays, well, if king to b1 was played at this point in order to defend the pawn, Black may continue with c5, attacking the defense shield of White's king, threatening the pawn on b4, and rook to b8 may come up at some point, which is no longer attacked by the queen. If a random move is played, I can grab the pawn, perhaps pawn recaptures, and now, for instance, rook to a4, and White's king will be without defenses. If c3, in order to protect the pawn, we can continue the pawn storm with c5, activating the bishop with tempo and a check, or we can move the queen to b6, adjacent the enemy king. So a defense with king to b1 will not work. White first chooses to trade off bishops, bishop to h6. I play bishop to e6, developing the bishop and attacking the pawn on a2. White grabs the bishop, I recapture, and if at this point White would try king to b1, once again we see the move c5. If a random move is played, again we can develop the rook, let's say rook to a4, attacking the pawn shield. So that won't work. If not a random move, pawn takes pawn, rook check, king to a1, and rook to b2, and we have two pawns under attack, and White will be in a losing position. So let's go back. After king takes bishop, knight to d4 was played, and instead of protecting his pawn on a2, which is not possible, white instead wants to recapture the threatening bishop on e6 and take on the double pawn on c6 as compensation for the lost pawn on a2. And although my pawns are doubled, this is actually a very good pawn which can be used to crack open the pawn shield and attack the pawn on b4. So I grab the pawn, white grabs my pawn with tempo, I play queen to d7, attacking the knight with tempo, and this knight is very difficult to defend with pieces because rook to a6 may come up, putting a second piece on that knight. And white plays b5. Well, if white were to retreat instead, let's say knight to d4, I can play c5 and the same problems will ensue for white. Pawn takes pawn attacking the knight, knight to e2, queen to b5, we are threatening a check, king will have to flee to d2, and perhaps rook to a8 will come up at some point. So retreating will not work. Instead, white goes for the outpost, the point of the aggressive pawn development, and this knight outpost is very self-sufficient. It prevents the development of the rook on b8, which is the sweet spot. It is still possible, but it will have to be through a rook sacrifice. The knight can no longer be captured, and I cannot develop the knight, the rook to b6 attacking the knight, because that is covered. Nor can I develop the rook to a5 attacking the pawn, because that square is covered as well. If you were to try a rook sacrifice at this point, let's say rook f2 b8, knight takes, queen recaptures, threatening check and recapture of the minor piece. If pawn takes pawn at this point, we can choose either queen to b2 check, king flees, rook takes knight, activating the rook and recapturing the minor piece. But after d7, the pawn on e7 will become under attack. Black can no longer hunt the enemy king, and there is a threat of promotion with the pawn on d7. So this will not work for black. Alternatively, if instead of the check we immediately go for the rook recapture, rook takes knight, white may continue with pawn takes pawn, threatening promotion, and if queen check at this point, king to d2, and once again we are threatening promotion, and black will have no advantage whatsoever. So a rook sacrifice is premature. So after b5, I play bishop to e6 instead, with a new attacking idea, trying to promote the passed pawn on a3. Play continues with, well, if king to b1 was played at this point, which it wasn't, in order to cover the a1 square. If we try a rook sacrifice at this point, knight takes, queen recaptures, king to a1 would be the mate. White plays rook to d4 in an attempt to move the rook further to b4, protect the pawn on b5 perhaps. I continue to push the pawn, making the b2 square available. Now the pawn is protected twice, but The king can step in, which it should. Now there are two pieces covering the a1 pawn promotion. I play bishop to f5, and now we can see that the pawn on c2 has become under attack, so one of the doubled pawns. And we see also that the king has become overextended, because he's needed to guard the a1 square and also the d2 square. And if you take a look at the position at this point, who would you think is best? The answer is no one. This game is still a draw at this point, even with a slight edge for white. But engines are notorious for being weak in the later middle game, and this is where the engine starts to mess up. Instead of the best move, rook to a1, which blocks the pawn promotion, attacks the pawn on a2, and gives the king the possibility to protect the pawn on c2, which wasn't played. Or instead of playing the aggressive move rook to h4, threatening a check with a mate after queen to h6. So if now, for instance, bishop captures, we get queen h6 check, king to g8, and then the checkmate. This move can be countered with h5. The first glitch of the game from the engine, rook h to d1, doubling up on the half open file. And it looks as if the engine doesn't understand that this pawn is under attack and can now be captured. So I captured the pawn on c2. White simply loses a pawn and has to waste a move in order to move the rook again. For instance, if king takes bishop at this point, I can simply promote. Rook takes, rook recaptures, and black will be winning. So the possibilities of white, what should he do now? The best move would be rook to e1 and acknowledge he made a mistake. He can play once again the in-between move rook to h4 and threaten the checkmate, which will be countered by h5. But the engine makes a game-ending blunder, plays rook to a1 in order to stop the pawn and perhaps counterattack with rook takes pawn on a2. So now can you spot the winning move for black? The winning move is simply bishop to b1, and unbelievably the engine doesn't spot it. This of course locks the rook in out of the game. He cannot recapture the bishop because pawn will recaptures and he will lose the rook for a minor piece and a pawn, and the pawn capture is also no longer possible because bishop will recapture. Meanwhile, my bishop still has control over the diagonal. White continues with a pawn storm, g4, so I no longer have to worry about ideas of rook to h4. And I play d5, and d5 is a gambit move. This normally loses the pawn, but I cut off the square on c4. So what white should play now is queen to f3. Now you can see there are two attackers on the pawn. If e6 is played to defend, simply queen to f6 check king to g8, knight e7 check, and this forces the loss of the queen. Queen recaptures knight, otherwise it would be checkmate, and queen recaptures. So this move will lose a pawn, but the gambit is that white will play another move, although black would still be winning if this would happen. Instead of queen to f3, gaining a pawn, white has the possibility to gain 2 pawns. White instead chooses for the move queen to g5, and this move attacks the pawn on e7, and after trading the queens it will be impossible to defend the pawn on d5. However, white made a crucial mistake because there's no longer any protection for the square on e2. So why is this square important? Well, now the rook sacrifice of black has come to full power, and I can play rook f2 b8, sacrificing the rook and threatening the check with rook takes pawn on b5. So if white were to continue with, say, queen takes pawn, hoping to trade off queens and gaining a pawn, I can play rook takes pawn check, perhaps rook to b4, which will not be sufficient, rook takes rook check, and now white will either lose the queen or the minor piece. So if rook takes knight, knight takes rook, I mean, he will lose the queen. Or if pawn takes, he will simply lose the knight. Alternatively, if not, queen takes pawn, but rook takes pawn is played, protected by the queen. I can play queen takes pawn check, the rook may step in, and now we can see queen to e2 check. This is why the square was important. And then perhaps queen to b3, queen to c2 is the checkmate. And now we can see why the gambit with the d5 move has paid off, covering the square on c4. Alternatively, if not queen takes pawn or knight takes pawn, but knight takes rook on b8 would be played, which was played, I can play queen takes pawn check, and of course once again rook to b4 is not possible because of queen to e2 check, queen to e2 check, king to b3, and we get the checkmate. So king to c1 was played. So rook takes knight on b8 was played, threatening queen to b2 check, also attacking this extremely sad rook on a1, which even no longer has the option to capture the bishop on b1, because pawn recaptures promoting to queen. Rook to d2 was played, preventing the check. Bishop to e4, now threatening queen to b1 check. Rook recaptures, pawn recaptures. So all the rook can do now is gain a pawn. And now a desperation move by the engine, queen to h6 check. I recapture, rook takes pawn, queen to f1 check, king to d2, queen takes pawn check, king to d1. So I grab the pawn, but I can grab them all for the moment, but this wasn't played. For instance, queen to g1 check, grab a pawn check, check, grab another pawn check, 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 grab another pawn, check, and the last pawn will also fall. So this would also have been possible and winning for black, of course. But faster would be immediately to go for the mate. Bishop to f3 check. King moves to c1. Queen e1 check. Only one square available. King to c2. And finally bishop to e4 checkmate. So that was the game against Deep Sjeng 3.0. I could have done better, but at least I didn't make any losing moves. And the engine played very well until it didn't, and it was especially weak in the later middle games. So I hope you enjoyed watching this game. Leave a comment and I'll see you next time. So I still have the engine and I want to check out how long it takes for the engine to realize that rook to a1 is a bad move. So rook to a1 is now the best move. Let's add a timer. And that would be 20 seconds.